Hey, welcome back to Between the Lines. I'm your host, Tyler Gray, and this week we are going to be talking about fanfiction. So, when I say fanfiction, you typically think, Star Trek being the start of fanfiction, becoming more popular with the internet, all that sort of stuff. However, you gotta go back a heck of a lot further if you're going to get back to the roots of it. To start off with, how do you define fanfiction? Is it simply a written work using characters or the same universe as a pre-existing work? Because that seems to be the modern understanding of what fanfiction is. And if you're using that as a definition, then you can go all the way back to the Aeneid, written between 29 and 19 BC by Virgil, because that uses Aeneas, a character from Homer's The Iliad. So technically the Aeneid is fanfiction of the Iliad. It's not unusual back then because it comes from this tradition of telling stories orally and passing them down by generation. And with each story, people could, change parts of it, add things in. Some people would tell completely new stories using the same characters or tie new stories to old stories. And this was sort of like how fanfiction works today. The only difference being that it wasn't written down and we don't have quite as clear an understanding of where it started. Fanfiction really didn't take off as a concept until the invention of the printing press, when started being able to publish works. Just 150 or 200 years after the invention of the printing press, we have another example of fanfiction, Paradise Lost, which is fanfiction of the Bible. It takes place during Genesis. It's a retelling of how Adam and Eve encountered the snake or Lucifer in the garden. Of course, if you want to look at something that is very much thought of as fanfiction instead of these more classical works, probably the earliest example of these sort of fan bases creating larger works of written fanfiction would be in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the fandoms around Jane Austen and Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was insanely popular. It was, Harry Potter of its day. It was massive. And when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock in 1893, fans were really upset. I mean, they held funerals. People would go out in black clothes to mourn the loss of this fictional character. And a lot of the fans didn't accept this killing off of the character and decided to start writing their own Sherlock Holmes to fill in the gap. A lot of these were collected and published in Ellery Queen's Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes in 1944. Some of them used barely changed names, such as Schlock Holmes. Totally throw people off there. And some were officially licensed by the Doyle estate. I mean, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle even bought the rights to a fanfic by architect Arthur Whitaker in 1911 and published it under his own name, which is not all that uncommon even nowadays, an author outsourcing their writing and then publishing it under their own name, which, it's published by the author, but it's not written by the author, so that's really fanfiction covered up. Jane Austen was also had a massive fan base around that same time, and there was a full Jane Austen fanfiction novel called Old Friends and New Fancies that was published in 1913. Now, the term fanfiction itself, according to Brave New Worlds, the Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction, the term fanfiction dates back to 1939. Unfortunately, the book does not say where it was first used. Or at least I have not been able to find that first usage. However, the modern idea of fanfiction, as I'm sure you all know, started with Star Trek. While, there were these individual published novels such as the Jane Austen stuff and the Sherlock Holmes works, and it really took off with the Star Trek fandom, with fan magazines that were handed out at conventions. This was before we had the internet to really help us boost that along. One of the most famous early ones being Spockanalia, a 90-page fanzine that was circulated in 1967 and was even read by the show's writers. I mean, a lot of our modern understandings and terminology come from the Star Trek fandom. The idea of fanfic starting with sci-fi, a lot of the terms such as /fic referring to shipping two characters together in a fanfiction, the term Mary Sue, which has become a very popular term not just in fanfictions but in all literary work. The term Mary Sue comes from Paula Smith's 1973 A Trekkie's Tale, in which the character is the youngest lieutenant in the fleet at only 15, is loved by absolutely everyone, and is just, the most amazing character ever. So smart, so pretty, so fantastic. And that is where we get the term Mary Sue as referring to a character that is just completely unrealistic and seems like complete wish fulfillment. Now, while these fanzines were the start of fanfiction, of course, the internet is what really allowed fanfiction to thrive. And with the early days of the internet, it was largely limited to small individual sites that were devoted to specific fandoms, like Cerebi.net for Pokemon, and, other, like message boards and chat rooms. The first large congregated site for fanfiction was fanfiction.net that launched in October 1998. And that has just blown up considerably to the point where there are literally millions of fanfictions on that site now. Some of those stories with millions of words each. So now that we've gotten an understanding of where it started and how it's developed throughout time, and how it's come to be on the internet, and how it's proliferated to the extent that it has, let's try and understand the attitudes about fanfiction. A lot of modern authors have differed on their stances towards fanfiction. Anne Rice, the author of the Vampire Chronicles, is famously against fanfiction of her work. She's probably one of the most famous authors that will go out of her way to say, no, you're not allowed to write fanfiction about my stuff, saying it dilutes the integrity of her characters and stories. However, to be fair, Anne Rice has also published BDSM Sleeping Beauty fanfiction, with one of her Sleeping Beauty fanfics published as recently as 2015. The first one being The Claiming of Sleeping Beauty, published in 1983. So I guess fanfiction is okay so long as you don't know who the author is? Other authors, such as Douglas Adams and J.K. Rowling, encourage fan work. Although there were some legal questions raised originally, James Potter and the Hall of Elders Crossing is a fanfiction written by American author G. Norman Lippert and was officially published in 2007. 50 Shades of Grey, of course. You cannot have a conversation about fanfiction without bringing up 50 Shades of Grey. Was fanfiction of Twilight, and it's sold over 125 million copies and has been made into a film. And of course, it got around copyright laws by simply changing the names of the characters. Now, copyright law goes back to the Statute of Anne in England in 1710. That was the first copyright law recorded. America soon followed, well, soon being a relative term here, by adopting an almost identical copyright law in 1790. The first uniform copyright law that was an international endeavor was the Berne Convention of 1887, which created a uniform copyright law between a lot of the countries in Europe, such as Germany, Italy, France, the United Kingdom. America did not actually enter that specific agreement until 1988, however. Although, even for the countries that were not a part of the Berne Convention and are not included in that agreement, they are still subject to the World Trade Organization, which includes most countries of the world, which requires members to accept almost all of the same conditions as the Berne Convention. Now, current U.S. copyright law depends on fair use, which is a very broad term, a very gray area. According to U.S. copyright law, fair use comes down to 4 factors. The purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for non-profit educational purposes. The nature of the copyrighted work. The amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Now, that sounds like a lot of mumbo-jumbo, so I'm going to break that down for you real quick. Basically, is the work in question, or fan fiction, or whatever it is it being used for a commercial nature? Is it going to, trying to sell to getting a profit for the writer, or is it being used for a non-profit educational purpose? The amount and substantiality of the portion used, meaning, did they use, say, like a single word from the original work in the fanfic, or did they flat out copy the entire original document? And finally, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work, meaning by writing this fanfiction or parody or critique or whatever, is it going to cost the original author money? Parody and criticism have been considered fair use. Fanfiction, however, still exists in a sort of legal gray area, and a lot of court cases, they've basically said you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And so there is still a lot of question about the legality of fanfiction, and should it be allowed, and will the courts allow it? Unfortunately, it is very difficult to fight a corporation on this sort of thing. Corporations are rather notorious for using copyright laws to send out cease and desist letters to people, even if their work would be covered under fair use, and hoping that they'll take it down based on the cease and desist. And if they don't, then they can threaten to sue or actually sue, because the corporations, have the money to absorb that cost, whereas these small-time authors do not. And so corporations have used this law to really stifle the fair use works. In combat to this, the Organization for Transformative Works was formed in 2007 to advocate the legality of fan works. They base most of their arguments on 4 aspects: that fan works do not deprive the owner of the source material of income. This is all, going back to the fair use laws, mainly that it's not stopping the owner from making any money. It's not preventing them from selling their own work. Fan works can work as free advertisement or promotion for the original source material, which I've seen in a number of cases. Fandoms such as Harry Potter, My Little Pony, all sorts of interesting fandoms creating fan works that captivate audiences, and then the people go, hey, this is really cool. I want to check out what this is based on. So a lot of these fan works can actually create revenue source for the original authors. The third main point that they use is that fan works are usually non-profit. This isn't always the case, such as with the James Potter and the Hall of Elders Crossing or 50 Shades of Grey, but for a lot of the cases it is a non-profit attempt. The fan works are not trying to sell their works. And finally, that fan works do not copy or attempt to substitute for the original work. I mean, they aren't direct copies of the text, it's creating its own work, just using the ideas within the original work. So, fanfiction has been around since pretty much the dawn of time, since the first people started telling stories around a campfire and then decided, you know what, that's a cool story, I like that character, no, how about I'm going to come up with my own story for that character. And it's evolved throughout the centuries, along with how we regard it and the laws around it. So we are still right now in a legal gray area around fanfiction. So it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out in the future, and hopefully they try to take a look back at the past a little bit and see how fanfiction has been a key component of storytelling throughout history. But guess we're all going to have to wait and see how that history turns out. And I hope you join me next time. I don't know what my next topic is going to be yet, but I will let you know when I start telling it. In the meantime, have a good night.